Excellent. So this is the first in our new season of lectures. We're just going to start off with the minutes of the previous ordinary meeting, which was held on Wednesday, the 9th of April 2025, in the rooms of the Society of Antiquaries. The Vice President, Dr. Stephen Sherlock, was in the chair, and Mr. Simon Marcus presented a paper on digging deeper, initial results from the A428. Some questions were asked by Jane Esden, Christine Woodford, Tony Fleming, and Stephen Sherlock. The Vice President and membership thanked the speaker, and the meeting ended at 6:05 p.m. And if everyone is happy with that as a record of the meeting, I will sign that. Okay. So just a couple of quick announcements before we move on to the main business of this evening. I hope everyone has noticed we have some lovely merchandise for sale this evening in the room. If you're watching online, I'm afraid you're missing out. We have some beautiful scarves, we have some lovely RAI ties, and also we're so ready for Christmas here. We have some Christmas cards for sale. So ladies and gentlemen, if I can tempt you to any, please do come and see us at the end. Also, to just give you notice of our forthcoming autumn meeting, which will be on the 22nd of November in Canterbury. So that is a day visit. We are planning to focus the visit on the World Heritage Sites, so we'll be visiting St Martin's, St Augustine's and the Cathedral. So we're looking forward to seeing as many members as are available to come and join us. And the booking form will be on the website this week. The details, outline details are there. The booking form's going up shortly. So, without any further ado, it is a great pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, who I'm sure is extremely familiar to this audience, as he's our, how are we terming it today? The ghost of honorary secretaries past. Irreplaceable, it will seem, because we haven't managed to replace Brian, so big shoes to fill. Brian has obviously had a long career in archaeology in the UK, so working for English Heritage and Historic England, and some really incredibly high-profile projects as well, such as those at Windsor Castle. So it's a great pleasure to have him speaking to us this evening and to kick off our lecture series for 2025-26, apologies. So without further ado, handing over to Brian.
Okay, thank you. One of the reasons I'm speaking tonight is that as Honorary Secretary, it's my job to organise the lecture programme, and I couldn't get anyone to do October. So here I am. I was also told shortly after, not before, mark that, becoming Honorary Secretary of this institute, that one of my duties was to have a lecture to hand in case a speaker didn't arrive, for whatever reason. This lecture was thus prepared, has been revised from time to time in light of papers read and conferences attended during that period, and also by visits made to sites during REI meetings, notably Skipton Castle, more of which later. So it is in a sense a product of my term of office. The introductory, yes, really? Is that better? Oh. Can you, everyone else hear? Okay, right. This view of 1798 shows the remains of the tower standing on a ridge above its 18th century successor, a building known as Cartside Villa. The tower house and part of its barmkin or defensive wall, immediately below it, are all that remains of the medieval castle, with 18th century estate buildings and cottages to its east, effectively the service yard of the castle. That's all these buildings clustered here. The service yard, rather, for the villa. So starting off with, where is it? The site of Cathcart Castle stands on the very eastern edge of the old shire of Renfrew, an area now absorbed, this part of Renfrewshire now being absorbed into the southern suburbs of Glasgow. It stands above a river, the White Water of Cart. Let's have a look at that. So here is a situation, as you see, in the suburbs of Glasgow with the infamous Cathcart Circle railway line up here. We have the castle on this ridge. At the end of the ridge is the snuff mill, which is the former medieval mill of the belonging to the castle. Over on this side of the high ground called Court Now, which is quite an interesting site, and is possibly a site of an earlier defensive site, possibly the Manorial Centre, when this is part of the kingdom, part of the kingdom known as Cumbria. And down here near the river, we have the site of Cartside Villa. This excerpt from Blau's map of Renfrewshire, 1654, showing the castle standing high in its rock over the river. A couple of the sites I mentioned. This is what's now known as the snuff mill. It was a former corn mill. It was vacant at the time we were digging, so that became our site office, which is great. It's now housing, so it has found a new use. And that stands beside and there it is down here, and it stands beside this bridge, a bridge of about 1700 across the Whitewater of Cart, where that's the site of an early crossing of the river. So these are quite important to the geography of the site. I'll let you absorb this quotation. It ends rather jarringly, describing the beautiful setting and the somewhat ugly ruin of Cathcart Castle. The fate of Cathcart Castle in the 20th century, as an ugly ruin in Glasgow's second loveliest park, was to be neglected. By the 1970s, the timber plate, you can see here, that actually retained tie rods linking the front of the building to the back. It almost completely decayed. There were substantial trees growing out of the top and ominous cracks developing in the front wall. So in December 1979, that happened. And as you can see, what was left was in a very precarious position. Further falls of masonry were likely in the imminent future. We can also see some of the inside. There are large areas of brickwork, which I will explain later. This is part of a 17th century remodelling of the interior of the tower. Discussions carried on for several months on the fate of this scheduled ancient monument. But in August 1980, Glasgow District Council started to make it safe by removing loose masonry. They certainly were thorough. Making safe is a euphemism for almost complete destruction and clearance. The surviving walls are nowhere more than 2 meters high, and all other walling was removed from the site. The foundations of the east wall of the tower, several centimeters of the underlying bedrock were scraped away by machine. Excavation was then planned to investigate the remains of the castle in advance of landscaping. And in consultation with the Inspectorate of Ancient Monuments and the Scottish Royal Commission, a research design, an early example of 1980, was developed to answer questions about the tower and its defensive enclosure or barmkin. It did not include this large level area in front of the castle, which was possibly a mistake, as this is where the castle service yard is likely to be, including buildings such as kitchens, stables, and all sorts of other things. But to be fair, we'd already bitten off more than we can chew with this trench, which had to be extended to the east because there was just so much in it. So why was the castle built here? I'm afraid this involves a bit of deep history, looking at the later history of the Kingdom of Strathclyde, later the Kingdom of Cumbria. A Brythonic kingdom, i.e. speaking Old Welsh, a dialect of Old Welsh, which persisted into the 11th century. After Dumbarton Rock was the former capital of Strathclyde, was sacked by the Vikings in 870 AD, the seat of power moved to Govan. Current research is showing the importance of Govan in the late 9th to 10th century. An early historic sculpture found there has now become a major tourist attraction. I recommend a visit if you haven't been to see it already. Cumbria remained a distinct region, not fully part of Scotland, for some time. King Alexander I appointed his brother David as Prince of the Cumbrian region, which is an interesting title, sort of foreshadows Prince of Wales later on, in 1107. David, of course, had remarkably close ties with Henry I, who was his brother-in-law, And he also had significant land holdings in the honour of Huntingdon, which made him a significant figure in England as well as Scotland. And he was to go on to use the civil war of the reign of King Stephen to fight in behalf of the Empress Matilda, as a loyal friend of the late Henry I, but also, of course, to advance his own designs on the English part of Cumbria and on Northumberland, which he occupied for much of the Civil War. As King David I, he used land grants to Anglo-Norman and Flemish families to integrate regions, notably Cumbria, more fully into the Scottish kingdom, while at the same time providing a military reserve through knight service owed to the crown. And that's linked with economic development. He was a noted founder of boroughs. So it's part of his economic development as well as ensuring control over this newly absorbed area. You can see that from the map of the land grants or feudalisation that's called here, there's a large compact lordship here, which is the lands of Strathgrife and North Kyle, which also includes Renfrewshire, which is granted to Walter FitzAlan, a landowner, a knight from Shropshire, and I think specifically the owner of Montgomery. There's also a large lordship in the borders, and as in the Welsh Marches, large lordships were generally formed as being more effective at organising the defence of vulnerable areas. In the case of this corner of Scotland, the vulnerability was it bordered with areas which were loyal to the King of Norway, including Argyll, the Western Isles, to some extent Galloway, and also the Isle of Man. So there was an active power struggle going on between Scotland and Norway over these areas, which lasted until about certainly up until 1263, when the Norwegian king was defeated at the Battle of Largs, around about here. So this was a border area. Walter FitzAlan was granted this large area in about 1136. It comprised Strathgrife, Renfrew and North Kyle, which is now part of Ayrshire, this area here. With main castles established at Renfrew, which is the county town of Renfrewshire now, and Dundonald. Walter was also appointed steward to King David I, a post that eventually became hereditary of Steward of Scotland, and of course gave rise to the family name Stewart, which some of you may have heard of. The lordship was sub-infeudated to Anglo-Normans who probably came north with Walter from Shropshire and Montgomery. Professor Archie Duncan showed that where their names are known, they could be identified with those areas, e.g. people named Lisle, Wallace and Montgomery. The place name Cathcart is first recorded as Cathcart in 1158, apparently combining the early Welsh element Caer, a fort or enclosure, and the name of the river. While there is no evidence other than the place name for an early historic occupation of Cathcart, occupation of that date has been suggested at nearby Crookston Castle. You can see here the later stone castle standing within a well-preserved 12th century ringwork. And that site is the subject of current research funded by the Castle Studies Trust. So it'll be interesting to see what evidence they pull out. But this is a site which has produced evidence for early historic occupation. And early occupation of that date has also been found definitively at Dundonald Castle in North Ayrshire. It's possible that Anglo-Norman incomers were adopting and refortifying early estate centres. But as I said, for Cathcart, the only tenuous evidence for that is the place name. The family of Cathcart, first mentioned in the person of Reinaldus de Cathcart in 1179, became highly influential in Renfrewshire and Ayrshire. Its interest in the latter shire becoming stronger, the inheritance of a number of baronies in 1376 at Sundrum, Dunmellington and Auchencrieve. This is a larger excerpt from the Blow map, just showing a quick bit of orientation. Cathcart is over here at the very eastern edge of Renfrewshire. Here's Crookston, which I just mentioned. Also the towns of Renfrew and Paisley with its abbey. And shown a vastly reduced scale is this very small borough of Glasgow, which of course is vitally important to me as my hometown. Okay, we finally get to the first of our two key personalities, Alan, First Lord Cathcart. He has a lovely bit of Scottish history. This lovely garden is named after the person whose body was thrown out of a window and landed here. His rise to fame is he inherited the Cathcart estate in 1447, and he was initially an associate of the 8th Earl of Douglas, travelling with him to Rome as late as 1450 to 51. He seems to have switched. There was a long power struggle which had run between the Douglases and the Crown, with the Douglases being a remarkably powerful family in the south, particularly in the south of Scotland. Cathcart seems to have switched sides decisively in the Crown to 1452, being rewarded by King James II by being made Lord Cathcart in the same year. He was also awarded more lands in Ayrshire. In the same year, the 8th Earl of Douglas unwisely accepted a guarantee of safe passage to meet the King at Stirling, despite the fate of the 6th Earl at the hands of the same king at the notorious Black Dinner in Edinburgh in 1440. Scottish history is great. The ensuing struggle eventually saw the destruction of Douglas power completely at the Battle of Arkenholm. As a baron, Lord Cathcart could now build a castle without a royal licence, which he probably started to do soon after. He continued to accrue a number of important offices throughout his long career. Became Mayor de Fee of Kyle, which is a sort of hereditary sheriff's officer in 1477, became Warden of the West March in 1481, Constable of Dundonald Castle in 1482, and here's Dundonald Castle. Absolutely stunning large residential tower on the site of an earlier castle, destroyed during the Wars of Independence. And Master of the King's Artillery in 1485. He remained an influential figure in Scotland into the reign of James IV until his death in 1497. While the Tower of Cathcart was no longer available for study, having been comprehensively made safe, we have a number of sources which allow an understanding of the extent of Lord Cathcart's work. There's some minor difference between the various drawings, but the evidence from these and from photographs allows us to reconstruct the building with some confidence. This survey is published in McGibbon and Ross, Castellate Domestic Architecture. It is based on a survey carried out by William Railton of Kilmarnock. At the time, the Earl of Cathcart, who owned the site again, was considering restoring it. So these are the plans and drawings of the castle as it was, and the proposed reconstruction of the tower, showing what Railton considered to be its original appearance. So a really important set of drawings showing a building of effectively 3 stories over a vaulted basement and with attic rooms as well. Railton made some strange decisions, such as placing the kitchen on the 3rd floor, which, given you need for a kitchen, you need a good supply of water, fuel, and good drainage, is an unlikely place to put it. But this is a time when towerhouses were seen as self-contained monuments, self-contained castles, and the kitchen had to go somewhere. So obviously we know now, and it's in the light of castle studies in Scotland in the last 30 to 40 years, that the tower is just one element of a medieval lordly residence, and it's likely to be the only one that survives in many cases because it's the best built. The cellular structure of the east wall is clear. You can see there's a large room built into the east wall, and there's also, as well as the staircase. This is a feature of castles built between the middle of the 15th century and the beginning of the 16th, such as Elphinstone Tower and David's Tower at Spiny Palace in Murray, and has contributed to instability and collapses at several of them. We're particularly fortunate at Cathcart in an early set of photogrammetric survey drawings from the late 1970s carried out by 2 Strathclyde University architecture students. This provides a valuable east-west section of the castle, and you can see here some of the evidence for brickwork. So the doors and windows, some of the door openings and so on have been rebuilt in brick, and there are also extensive areas of plain brick walling throughout. That also shows clearly the building had been erected at some point against the southeast corner of the tower, leaving a raggle or roof scar. on the face of the tower. And this back wall actually is part of the rear wall of the building, built around the southeast corner of the tower. In consultation with the Scottish Development Permanent Ancient Monuments Branch, as I said, and the Royal Commission, there was an excavation sponsored, funded by the Manpower Services Commission, sponsored by the People's Palace Museum in Glasgow, as planned to investigate the plan of the tower and attest the existence of the Barmkin enclosure on the north, east and west sides. Area 2 to the west of the castle, east of the castle rather, was later expanded and it was clear there's a particularly complex archaeology in this area. An excavation took place from November 1980 to August 1981. It was eventually published in 2016, so bear in mind the Kerr family motto is late but in earnest. The general layout of the 15th century tower and its enclosure was confirmed by excavation. The tower was remarkably tightly contained within a tiny barmkin. At the southeast corner, the tower appears to have been added to an earlier wall, which you can see shown in grey here. But the southwest turret here was an entirely original feature, standing in a spur of bedrock, which had been removed otherwise. Most dramatically, the tower was cut off from the rest of the ridge by a massive rock-cut ditch. Far deeper would have been allowed for safe excavation, but of course, being the 1980s, that didn't stop us. A ledge in the inner face of the ditch showed the location of the bridge and gatehouse. And we also had another enclosure to the west of the castle, which we interpreted as a garden enclosure. There was also in the centre of the building a large cistern or well, showing that the castle did, after all, have a water supply, as we might have hoped. One of the discoveries, looking at the castle walls more closely, surviving walls more closely, was that there was reused masonry built into the core of the stonework. Here we see a large voussoir. I'm afraid the scales of 5-inch nail, which is all I had to hand at the time. And the building their stone was smashed by vandals soon afterwards, so that's the only record of it. We also found in the base of the ditch, eroded from side, considerable amounts of 12th to 15th century pottery. So taking those two pieces of evidence together, it suggests that this was the site of the earlier manorial centre, possibly also fortified and containing quite nice masonry buildings to judge from the quality of this voussoir on the same site as the later castle. This is the dramatically unsafe ditch section, and that's the ledge for the bridge and gatehouse. And on the west side of the castle, we have the enclosure wall, which was partially dismantled. The stone's been dragged out of position, but not fully removed because it was quite well buried, with a later enclosure wall built above it and an accumulation of garden soil built up against the face of the wall. This is a drawn reconstruction. At the time, we initially interpreted this enclosure at the back as a building, but we now think it's a garden. But otherwise, it's quite a good impression of what the castle would have looked like shortly after being built, accepting Railton's proposals for the appearance of the tower at the top. There's a superficial resemblance to Thrieve, which I possibly overdid in the excavation report, but certainly there is a projecting, as at Thrieve, there's a projecting turret above the gate, directly above the gatehouse, but not over the castle entrance. And looking at the plan in more detail, we can see that there's a small building the small room built into the corner. This, of course, in the old style was interpreted as a pit prison, but these days I think it's more likely to consider it as a strong room with an office for the Cathcart steward in the room above, entered by a hatchway. This area also had direct access to the basement via a stair, and you can also see there's quite an elaborate arrangement for the mid-15th century of a straight staircase up to first floor level, with a spiral staircase rising above that. If Thrieve was used as an example, here's Thrieve by comparison. Here we have the 14th century tower built by Archibald the Grim, Earl of Douglas, with a mid-15th century artillery enclosure built around it. But why would it be modelled in Thrieve? It's been pointed out that that tower houses were built according to the owner's means and estate, and often their ambition. Well, despite his former association with the Douglases, Alan de Cathcart became an important figure, gaining lands and office as his influence increased. Becoming warden of the West March in 1481 was critical because Thrieve was the main stronghold of the West March, so he would have known it well, both from his association with the Douglas and from his later office as warden of the West March. It might be expected that his growing power would have been reflected in the buildings that he created, which would be physical manifestations of his success. Obviously, the sites are completely different. Cathcart stands on a rocky ridge. Thrieve stands on an island in the middle of a river. So they can hardly be more different. The artillery defence for Thrieve was advanced for its time, allowing guns to be mounted in 2 levels and the towers to provide flanking fire along the adjacent curtains. The much smaller size and scale of the Cathcart barmkin suggests this resemblance was for show, perhaps as an emblem of Lord Cathcart's status and success. After Lord Cathcart's death, their family land holdings in 1497, the family land holdings continued to develop in Ayrshire, notably Sundrum, Demolition and Auchencreevy estates, but with the addition of additional estates later on. This led to a change in focus for the landed interests, followed by a change in the religious affiliations. This is Paisley Abbey, a Cluniac priory founded in 1163 by Walter FitzAlan, and is notable as the daughter house of Much Wenlock Priory, again emphasising the Shropshire Welsh Marches link to the barony of Renfrew. But it was raised to abbey status in 1245, and here we have a column bearing the arms of Cathcart. There's also a Cathcart aisle in the surviving medieval fabric of the church. So again, it's worth visiting if you haven't been already. But by the time Lord Cathcart was being buried in 1497, they changed allegiance. He was now being buried at the Blackfriars Church in Ayr, which the family continued to support. So Cathcart, I think, was becoming peripheral to the family's interests. The move was made final in 1543 when the Cathcarts broke up and sold their estate, moving entirely to Ayrshire, based at Sundrum. The tower and fortalice of Cathcart were sold by the third lord to his wife's uncle, William Semple, and a member of another major Renfrewshire family of Anglo-Norman origin. And of course, being Scottish history, both parties died soon afterwards at the Battle of Pinkie in 1547. The castle remained in the hands of the Cathcart branch of the Semple family, and it was inherited in 1627 by our second figure, Bryce Semple of Craigbait, a small estate near Kilmacombe. Bryce made a number of changes to the castle, which I'll describe shortly. He was an ambitious man and clearly of some means. He'd been Sheriff Depute of Renfrew since 1623, had bought the office of Sheriff by 1636, and he was a member of the Renfrewshire County Committee during the Civil Wars, just charged with raising forces, maintaining peace and the country's religion. And also in 1644 was made responsible for rounding up fugitives from the army. He made a very ambitious marriage to Jean Lauder of Halton, later known as Hatton near Edinburgh, the daughter of Marie Maitland, a noted writer and poet, and her father was Alexander Lauder, and his wife's father was Alexander Lauder, who was the Sheriff Principal of Edinburgh. And the link to the Maitland family is important. Maitland had been James I Chancellor in Scotland, and later on they raised to the status of Dukes of Lauderdale under Charles II, so important and very influential relations. It's a very ambitious marriage. The marriage was featured prominently in the remodelling of the tower interior, which took place in about 1630. Large quantities of plasterwork were excavated, including strapwork mouldings, such as here. We have scrolls from cartouche panels. We have a wide variety of floral decoration, pomegranate, grapes, ivy leaf, flower. And of critical importance, explain shortly, is this billet head ornament, which gives some idea of the scale, height, and plan of the roof. We also, of course, animal mast ornament. A prominent feature of this plasterwork display were the arms of Semple. In this case, is Semple of Cathcart, which has the checkered chevron, 2 hunting horns above, and a fleur-de-lis below. The main Semple family arms had 3 hunting horns, so this suggests he's a member of a cadet branch of the same family. And on the right are the arms of Lauder of Halton. So he's showing off his dynastic connections in style in his newly decorated tower interior. There are some examples. This is from Bankart's Art of the Plasterer in 1908, which includes drawings of large numbers of 17th century plaster ceilings which no longer survive. So it's very helpful. In the most elaborate ceilings, they use and with lots of height, they use large pendants to create a more dramatic effect. Cathcart was a much lower hall. You couldn't have pendants in it without constantly banging your head off them. So they used the triangular, the billet head ornaments, sometimes singly, sometimes clustered in groups, to provide a greater impression of relief and depth in the ceiling. So it's an interesting architectural effect. But essentially, the strapwork panels, which can be a variety of designs, we had curving and straight elements, form decorative compartments filled with molded decoration, which is stuck on. Here's a group of these billet head ornaments forming a sort of pendant of this diamond-shaped pattern. The coat of arms is like to be part of an elaborate overmantel over the fireplace. As part of this work, I'll have to go back a bit, the interior was remodelled in brickwork, which is quite an early use of this material in the west of Scotland. Generally don't get it used in urban buildings, from my experience, until the 18th century. It's an unusual form, quite flat. And instead of having a frog, they've got these square impressions in the surfaces. And they were clearly made at a pottery production site. A number of them had splashes of green glaze on them, suggesting this is an unusual commission with bricks being made specifically for the project at a local pottery. Possibly part of the same works, but it may have been added sometime later. All we know about the dating of the next phase is that the buildings here are described as new at the end of the 17th century, but don't know what that means, relatively new or brand new. But in any case, what happened was that the barmkin was comprehensively demolished, apart from the sheer drop along the southern edge, and a building was built clasped around the southeast corner of the tower, the back wall here, and the side wall will be built across the line of the ditch, the cellar inserted where the building crossed the line of the ditch. That shows the wall, which was built into the ditch. This must have been built before the ditch was backfilled. So this would have been built first as part of the setting out of the new building, and the rest of the ditch backfilled around it. As you can see, the wall was built, the south wall was built abutting the drum tower at the corner of the barmkin enclosure, and one wall of it was formed with the bedrock of the ditch. Just looking the other way, you can see the base of the east wall of the building. The floor was covered by a thick layer of coal dust, suggesting certainly its last use was a storage for coal. And that's a plan of the revised building. Just getting my place again, I get carried away there. Excited with the plasterwork. The removal of the barmkin, the infilling of the ditch, allowed the creation of this new range on the east of the castle, with the original entrance now sitting in the re-entrant angle between the two buildings. The absence of the evidence of design and decoration of this new range, it's difficult to say much about its function and relative status. Was this a new service range that would provide additional accommodation? It's perhaps significant there's no direct communication between the two buildings. Where fancy 17th century buildings are added to castles such as Drum, there's generally an entrance forced from the new work into the old. In this case, there was no such attempt. The building was simply butted up against it, which perhaps support the service range interpretation. By the end of the 18th century, perhaps as a result of the expenditure on of improvements to Cathcart, the Semples of Cathcart were struggling financially. By 1725, they had to sell the estate, which came into the possession of William Maxwell of nearby Williamwood, who had his own house, and their suggestions that the family used the proceeds of their sale to move to Ireland. The castle was then leased out to tenants, but with varying degrees of success, and by 1740 to 50, a decision was taken to build a new villa of Cartside, which would be a much more easy holiday let, and to demolish the tower. We're lucky, and we do actually have a description of what they tried to do. This is from the first statistical account of Scotland of 1791 to 99, which describes how the tower was inhabited within 50 years of the writing, but it was demolished for building material. It describes how they took off the roof or proceeding the rest of the building when they had to stop at the resistance they met with from the strength and thickness of the walls. Having been left since that time in a dismantled state, it scarcely suffered any further injury from the influence of weather. And this shows the building after the attempted demolition. Rubble from the castle was used to form a ramp leading up from the Barmkin enclosure platform down to the lower ground to the east, with a small revetment wall built against the slope. Part of the 17th century building was retained as a small shed. A new building was built over the cellar, the backfill cellar, and we know from historic photographs and plans that a set of cottages was built here in the 18th century. The demolition can be seen in this plan of the third floor, and you can see that the demolishers were working their way down through the walls using weak points such as the existence of chimney flues in this wall. The hatched areas are reconstructed in this plan. Obviously, the stair was a major source of good stone, and that could be taken down further, as could much of the cellar construction of the north wall. But here they just removed some stonework around the window jambs. So they made good progress on the third floor, but stopped there, particularly you can see here, the absence of the stair turret in the south northeast corner. Anyone who attended Richard's lecture on slighting will know this is a method known as picking, where you're using hand tools, labourers and hand tools, to take the building apart from the top down. Where demolition accounts, where this has been used in slighting of castles, notably at Pontefract, for example, all this profit from the demolition came from the removal of lead and from the removal of timber. And clearly, this building probably had stone flag roofs, but there would have been a certain amount of lead in the windows, and obviously large amounts of timber in the interior of the building. So those would have been taken out and might have been sold off for some profit. But at Pontefract in the 17th century, the demolition of the stone walls produced precisely zero profit. They didn't make any money at all, even though Pontefract was a town in need of rebuilding after the Civil War. So it's unlikely. I think partly the thickness of the walls stopped them from demolishing it, but I think the return they were likely to get from carrying on was so limited as to make it not worth doing. The late 17th century building was almost entirely demolished, and its cellar was filled with the demolition debris and the contents of the tower. That leads on to one of the most remarkable features of the excavation, the sheer quantity of finds. In particular, from the backfill cellar, this is packed full of plasterwork and stonework from the buildings, as well as masses of pottery, glass, and animal bone. What has become known in recent years as a clearance deposit. essentially everything that was in the tower, which they couldn't take away and sell or reuse, was thrown away into this single large assemblage. It's the most productive context I've ever excavated. In one day, from one context, I filled a wheelbarrow with finds. Some idea of the volume of stuff we're getting. And it gives a really valuable insight into the material culture of the small upper class household on the outskirts of Glasgow in the early 18th century. There were some finds in this period relating to use, from the garden enclosure to the west of the site. Here you can see the build-up of garden soils, and that's the 18th century retaining wall I mentioned. We did get some clay pipes. These are all made by John Colquhoun of Glasgow, a pipe maker known to have been in production in Glasgow from 1670 to 1730. Pipes in this manufacture were exported to the eastern seaboard of North America. They also turned up in the excavation of the ill-fated Darien colony. The question is whether these are smoked by the residents and the visitors in the garden or by gardeners. The implication that these seem to be polished pipes at the higher end of the manufacturing scale, so it is more likely to be visitors and owners. Turning to the clearance assemblage, the finds cover a fairly wide date range from the late 17th to the first half of the 18th century. The assemblage is, of course, skewed. We can't know what they didn't throw away, what they took away from the site. What we're left with is what was abandoned on the site at the time of its partial demolition. So, to state the obvious, the occupants were clearly drinking wine in large quantities of it, judged from the large number of bottles we found on the site. We also found a number of wine glass stems from the first half of the 18th century. We also have small scent or medicine bottles. This one survived intact, despite having been hurled against a wall, but it's quickly buried. So that's the only one that survived intact. We did get fragments of others. We also found a remarkably wide range of pottery from a number of different sources. We have, of course, tin glazed earthenware, produced in a variety of centres. Some of it is European, Northwest Europe. Others come from sites in England, such as Liverpool. Possibly some from Glasgow's Delfield pottery, which was established in the middle of the 18th century. We also have large amounts of Chinese porcelain, these tea bowls, porcelain plate, and we also have salt glazed stoneware, probably from Staffordshire. And this is a photograph from a publication showing a typical mug of the sort that we excavated on site, with these distinctive salt glazed stoneware, very thin bodied, with this brown glazed top, which would be ideal. So I think it's illustrating the range of things that were being consumed. It's like they were drinking coffee and chocolate as well as tea. The tea bowls, of course, suggest they were drinking tea as well. Also, not illustrated here, there were large numbers of tin glazed earthenware chamber pots. So far as we can tell, there were no drains built into the castle itself. So everything had to be removed by hand by servants. So there's no evidence for latrines at all whatsoever. The ceramics also included large quantities of later green glaze wares, either still in use at the beginning of the first half of the 18th century or lurking in dusty corners. These included cooking pots, mixing bowls, fish dishes, pitchers, and jugs. Some of the green glazed chamber pots, yes, we had green glazed chamber pots as well, were reused as paint kettles with thick deposits of lime wash still inside them. That's exactly the sort of thing you expect to find tucked away in the corner of a dusty cellar. It might be useful someday, we'll just keep it. Iron objects, which I haven't illustrated here, include a currycomb and horseshoes, of course, evidence for stabling. And there's also a small assemblage of tools related to gardening, horticulture, and weed clearance. The animal bone came mainly from the ditch fills of 15th to 17th century date, but the some bone is also recovered from the demolition deposits. Much of the finds assembled material seems to have been smashed deliberately, with lots of it lying against the east wall of the cellar. In this case, part of a pitcher crushed against the east wall. It was clearly seen as worthless, at least not worth more than the fun of smashing it up. There's nothing quite so much fun as smashing up someone else's stuff, I imagine. While we might be excited today to find a chipped tin glazed earthenware plate at a car boot sale, this material was seen as outdated at the time. Why salvage a mismatched collection of old cups and plates when the growing fashion was for matching dinner services? We're back to this illustration again. It shows the result of the demolition and the building work, so the villa at Cartside, the remains of the tower, and the small estate yard associated with the villa in front of the castle. The new house and castle came into the hands of the Cathcart family again, who decided to buy it in 1805. And they resided, this became a Scottish pied-à-terre. Their main residence was in England. I believe they currently live in Norfolk. But this became the Scottish pied-à-terre. They commissioned, in 1866, they commissioned William Railton, an architect of Kilmarnock, to draw up plans for the reconstruction of the castle. Railton's 1866 survey drawings form the basis for the description of the castle in the McGibbon and Ross's Castellated Domestic Architecture of Scotland. The project wasn't executed, but it's clear that some repairs were made at the time. You can see this is I mentioned this earlier, this timber plate and the iron tie rods, which are used to try and tie the vulnerable east wall of the castle back to the full width of the castle, back to the more stable east wall. And that seemed to work for some time until, of course, the timber plate rotted. It's clear that all attempts had also been made to repoint the walls. Unfortunately, they used cement, which, as any building conservation specialist will know, is a really bad move, because if you've got a building which is suffering from water ingress, the last thing you want to do is trap the water inside it with impermeable cement. So that probably did more harm than good. This nice snapshot of the castle as it was, this one's from 1913, with the very charming estate workers' cottages to the side. The Cathcart's family moved out of Cartside Villa after the First World War, and the estate was sold to Glasgow Corporation in 1927. In the usual style, the house was quickly demolished, and its grounds formed the core of the new Lynn Park. The cottages and other structures were cleared at some time after 1935. So no longer people living in the site, which meant it was also vulnerable to vandalism, which grew in extent throughout the 20th century. The site was backfilled in 1981 and plans were made to display it, but these came to nothing. Recent photographs show the surviving walls covered with graffiti and the site covered with thick vegetation. If anyone knows of any plans to consolidate the site, I'd be delighted, but I'd also be quite surprised. The archive, including the finds, has now been deposited at Glasgow Museums. And the excavation was published in 2016 as available free of charge, thanks to Historic Environment Scotland, who funded the analysis and the open access publication. And that's it. Are there any questions?
Okay. Do we have any questions? I can come round with a microphone.
The word barmkin. The word barmkin.
Yeah, it's a word used in Scotland to describe an enclosure built around a towerhouse, usually containing other estate buildings. But as you can see in the case of Cathcart, it's far too small for that. There's barely enough room to walk around the castle, let alone have other buildings inside it. But normally, most castles would have had them. I think there's actually a law saying people should build them to defend their households properly. But it was, in this case, it's built with turrets and other designs are available. And often they only survive because parts of them found later uses. If you go to Newark Castle near Port Glasgow, there's a beautiful stretch, a corner of the barmkin only survives the corner turret was turned into a dovecote or ducat in the 16th century. They're much less well built, less strongly built than the tower houses, so they often don't survive at all. But there are quite a few roundabout, if you know where to look.
That was definitely a new word for me as well. That was going to be my question. Were there
I did
any...
say enclosure or barmkin.
No, I got what it was. I've never heard the word before, so it's really interesting. Were there any other questions for Brian? Richard?
It's, I'm afraid, more of a comment than a question. But I thought it was really interesting to have that quote about 50 years after someone bought the castle and started to dismantle it, and how they said they stopped because the walls were too thick.
Yes.
It's a really nice story, but 50 years removed, I wonder if it's just a little bit too convenient. And I thought that your explanation by comparing with Pontefract and how dismantling it didn't actually produce much financial incentive was much more compelling.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to kind of endorse that particular angle, because though the walls being too thick, it's a nice story. It's these big medieval buildings.
Yeah.
I think that the economic reality there is perhaps more compelling.
These descriptions in the first statistical account were generally written by the ministers of each parish. I don't know how long that particular minister had been there. So he might have been there for a good 20 years by that stage. So it's possible that he was passing down genuine word-of-mouth reports, but as you say, he may not have been. He may just have been making it up as he went along.
Were there any other questions from the audience? I have a question, if that's okay. So you mentioned there was this huge finds assemblage of smashed materials, and it's now been deposited with Glasgow Museum. Have they ever put any material on display or reconstructions? Is there any sort of proposals to make a lot of the assemblage, given the state of the remains?
That's a good question. There is a small display in Cathcart itself, in the suburb of Cathcart. I think it's the old halls. Certainly was the display of some of the plasterwork, including the coat of arms, because it makes this nice display material. Some of the pots were reconstructed and were featured in a display at Glasgow Museums in about 1981-82, showing some of the material coming out of excavations in Glasgow. We were part of a small unit excavating in Glasgow city centre at the time. I was the one who was exiled to the south side, strangely because I knew what a barmkin was. That word again. But I don't know if there's plans for any more ambitious display of Cathcart. It'd be nice if there was, but that's up to Glasgow Museums.
With all the stories that you've been able to tell, looking at the heraldry and the conditions in which they were found as well, and how you can draw stories out of that, it sounds like the assemblage has some real potential for.
I think it has.
Taking that
I think
forward.
there's more that could be done with it. I think you could actually have a serious go at reconstructing the ceiling in more detail. We're joining fragments. So it'd be nice to have a go at reconstructing it properly.
Yeah, that'd be amazing.
To get a better idea of its layout. That's a distant dream. I've done my job.
Should we end on it? Oh no, we've got a question here from Howard.
That was really interesting. That was really interesting, and I was fascinated by your opening comment about the political geography and the Old Welsh.
Yes.
And the complexity there. And obviously thinking very much about the English-Welsh border and how the modern border often in people's minds gets back projected. Is there any way in which heritage interpretation or popular history in those areas explains something of that complexity of the history of the region?
The new display centre at Govan Old Parish Church is doing a good job of that, because obviously they've got an outstanding collection of carved stonework there, which is a bizarre sort of Brythonic Viking synthesis. You've got hogback tombstones as well as interlaced carved crosses. So it does seem a strange and foreign culture to us now, but I think the Govan and the work, the museum and the Govan Church and the work that Steve Driscoll's doing, research into the early kingdom of Cumbria, is actually beginning to raise people's understanding of it. It's interesting. The press around the latest excavation, which only I think it was going on a couple of weeks ago, described it as new discoveries in Scotland's unknown kingdom. So it's still it's not really in the popular consciousness, but I think it's beginning to get there. I think the work is having a govern is going a long way towards that.
Hello, Brian. That's very interesting indeed. And it's very easy to get the impression that these were gloomy, great piles of stone. I just wondered if there's any parallels that in Scotland that might show what actually it looked like inside when it was used, and to do with how it was decorated or just worked. And
there are several examples. Some of them are great houses rather than castles. There's Winton House near Edinburgh, which has plasterwork. Winton, which has plasterwork exactly of this type. I think Lennoxlove Castle, formerly known as Lethington, does survive, and that has 17th century plasterwork inside it. But it's now a private residence of the Dukes of Hamilton, so it might not be accessible. But I think the best example is probably Craigivar Castle in Aberdeenshire, which is National Trust for Scotland, which has a huge barrel-vaulted ceiling over its hall, which has got fantastic 17th century plaster on it. It's a beautifully decorated room. I think there's a real impression of what it would have looked like. So I'd recommend a visit to Craigivar. But they really went to town on that one because it was such an exceptional vaulted stone ceiling over the hall, that it provided lots of opportunity for elaborate displays. And the builder was an incredibly wealthy merchant, so he could afford it. That's the nice thing with that decorating, it's sort of scalable. You can have simple ceilings, such as the one saw in the houses in Edinburgh, or you could have really elaborate ones like Craigivar or Winton, using the same basic elements, but obviously elaborating on them for the larger, more ambitious ceilings. And that's the only one that we know of, as far as I'm aware, from the west of Scotland. Where they survive, it tends to be in Edinburgh, the Lothians, or the northeast. We just don't have any others in the west of Scotland. It doesn't mean there weren't any. But that's the only one that's turned up in excavation so far.
I think if that is all of the questions for our speaker this evening, it just remains to say thank you very much once again to Brian for such a fantastic opening event for our season this year. Thank you all for coming along, and look forward to welcoming you back in November for our next lecture, which will be by Professor Richard Bradley. So we'll draw this evening to a close. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Switched